Welcome to Happy Talks with Dr. Alice and Donovan. Dr. Alice Fong is a holistic naturopathic doctor and founder of Amour de Soi Wellness, and Donovon Jenson is a software engineer and founder of HowToHappy.com. Together, they're out to cause more happiness in the world.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Happy Talks. My name is Dr. Alice, and this is my awesome co-host, Donovan. And today we are going to be talking about how to deal with toxic people. Yes, a great topic because we've probably all been there. So, Donovan, where would you like to start this conversation on how to deal with toxic people?
Yeah, so I'll just do what I normally do, which is ramble for a bit. What
Sounds like a plan.
comes to mind 1st. So when I think about how to deal with toxic people, there is, again, and I've talked about this a bunch of times, but different situations or the type of relationship matters a lot, right? It's going to be different if it's a one-off, like, oh, this person is just going berserk at the restaurant I'm at, and I don't know them, as opposed to my parent, my sibling, my partner, whoever else is really exhibiting a bunch of behaviors that are actually impacting me negatively. So I think the first place that I want to start is maybe some of the identification pieces, right?
Right.
Because one of the things that I've seen, both in myself and other people, is sort of this leniency given to certain types of behavior, and not really chalking it up to toxic when it actually could be defined as that way. So I'd be interested in sort of your take on that angle, and what you've seen.
Yeah, I would say, starting out, I do kind of want to do a distinction between a toxic person and toxic behavior. I think it's really important to tease out, because just because someone may have not learned emotional development skills and does things poorly and maybe doesn't validate your feelings, which isn't a great thing to do, obviously, but I think people can develop emotionally and become less toxic with their behavior, and it doesn't mean that they're a bad person. But it's kind of, for me, like, my first thought is, when I think of toxic people, and I'm kind of just rambling my first thoughts too. I think of, because I've had like a relationship. I just go back to my own experience, and that, like, my very first relationship, the first person that I fell in love with actually ended up being a liar and a cheat. And I honestly think he possibly could have been a sociopath, where he just didn't have any remorse for his terrible behaviors, that I just was young and naive and in love and stupid. And so I just kind of allowed myself to ignore all the red flags, but learn from that valuable experience of, and not dating anyone to that degree anymore. But, fast forward later, years later, maybe even a decade later, less than a decade later, I was dating someone that I didn't honestly think was a bad person, but just like the way we interacted, just in how we would like get together and break up and get together, break up. It was just like a very toxic relationship, but I still think he's a good person. But just like how we would behave with each other, and it didn't bring out like the best in me either. So, I realized maybe there's things that I do. I'm not 100% a perfect angel by any means, but I get that, like, maybe certain types of behaviors or personalities don't mesh well with me, and that doesn't bring out the best in me. And so clearly that was not going to be a healthy relationship for me to be in. So that's where I like to start. I don't know if I really answered your question.
Yeah. That's okay. I feel like there are some really important things that we can dig into and kind of pick apart from that, because I do think it's important, like you said, to look at the distinction between whether it's toxic behavior or a toxic person or a toxic relationship, because all of those pieces impact sort of the path forward, right?
Right.
So I think maybe the first place that we can start digging around is basically this idea of, like, if you run into someone with toxic behaviors or a toxic relationship, the willingness of the parties involved to actually work on whatever it is that's not going correctly, that's the ideal situation, or at least the first thing that comes to my mind that you would try to want to tackle, right? If
Right.
if I'm interacting with my spouse or siblings or parents or whoever in ways that suck, if there is space on both ends to say, hey, like when I do this, you tend to do this, then I respond this way. You sort of can break down some of the pieces and try to find angles to make a little bit of space, make things a little bit better. And then there is this completely different category of toxic people, like you were saying, who just have no interest or regard or desire to change in any way whatsoever. And maybe that's where we should focus. Maybe we should focus the other direction. It's we'll see where it goes. But I'd be curious what your sort of thoughts are on the more toxic person side of things. What are some of the red flags? Because you kind of mentioned that a little bit, and that you've seen, and sort of what did you do to extract yourself from the situation? Because it seems like these embedded relationships with toxic people are going to be very tricky to unravel.
Right. Yeah. No, that was so long ago. I was like 19 when I first met him. So a very long time ago. I think like the red flags that I ignored were just, just ticking him. And I generally don't think it's a bad thing to take people at face value of like what they say. You assume is true generally, but that's not always the case. And so it was just kind of like things he would say that would not line up, like weren't in congruence. I don't feel like I could be a liar because I could not keep track of the lies. My memory would not be able to handle that. I could just remember what happened if I can remember what happened. But yeah, just, noticing if there's a lot of incongruencies in actions and behaviors, or in what they say and speak. I'd say, if they seem really secretive, although I want to give a caveat that, maybe they could develop themselves to be more open and vulnerable. I would say they're wanting to, and this wasn't my first relationship, but just other toxic like red flags, I'd say like, hey, keep an eye out. This isn't necessarily my experience, but I'd say if they're trying to like keep you away from people that you care about, that's a red flag. I haven't had that experience before, but I'd say that's definitely a red flag. If they consistently invalidate your feelings and make you think you're crazy, that's called gaslighting. And that's just, I think to some degree, I admit that there have been moments where I have been like a little a little like less than healthy behavior, but when they're kind of just like making you question, like if they are cheating on you and they're saying, oh, you're crazy, but you just really have like this gut feeling that might be happening. It's like, okay, you can't really verify yes or no, but you also give yourself some grace to, be okay that you have some fears. And I think as far as like dealing with some of these like toxic people that are constantly putting you in a place of feeling disempowered, feeling less than, like you're not good enough, feeling like you can never do anything right, feeling like you can never just like be like fully respected and loved. I think those are definitely red flags. It's like, why are you with that person? But for me, realizing that as someone who had to do a lot of development, I didn't realize at the time that I had a lot of like self-worth and self-love issues to work on myself, because for me to put up with all the things that I put up with at this day and age, I would not put up with that kind of shit, honestly. But like back then, it's just like, well, I'm in love, so I can put up with these ridiculous red flags that would just keep me pulling. And I didn't have enough love for myself to be able to walk away. And that took a lot of building my self-confidence and my self-worth to be able to do that. So I think that had been years in development of being able to be able to walk away when someone's not good for you. They, it's like, yeah, there's passion and excitement, but then there's like this drop in depression and just like you feel terrible all the time. I think relationships are going to have like roller coasters, but when it's like extremes, that's something to be wary of and cautious of. Especially when it just is leaving you feeling bad about yourself all the time. So that's where I'd like to start. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's some important points that you raised. Um, you mentioned several different attributes, and I think if it's just one thing in certain one-off situations, that's fine. But when you start seeing patterns or you start seeing clusters of, oh, well, their stories don't really add up, and they seem to invalidate everything I say, and this other thing is going on, it that's when you need to start to like really pay attention to things. Another thing I thought of while you were talking is sort of listening to the people around you, right? Because I know that some of the relationships that I've had, both friends and romantic partners and whatever else, um, other people would say like, "Hey, the way that this person is treating you is not good," or like, "Hey, this story doesn't make sense to me." And I think it's important to sort of listen to those signals. I mean, I'm sure we've all heard the stereotype of like the the new lover that somebody gets and then they just don't listen to anyone, even though everyone's like, what are you doing? This person is horrible.
Right.
But trying to tune into those things a little bit more. Another thing for me, from my experience, a red flag is basically someone saying that, basically paying lip service to the fact that they're willing to change and not making any actual effort, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's not necessarily realistic to expect people to be perfect
Yeah.
while they're trying to work on things.
Totally.
But I think the big piece, or at least, from my experience, what I've seen is people not willing to take responsibility after saying they were willing to change. And basically saying like, well, I couldn't do it right this time because of this, and I couldn't do it because of this, and I couldn't do it because of this. And especially when that continues to play out over time. I've got one specific relationship in mind, but basically this person would just continually pay lip service to all these things and continue the behaviors and then shift blame out. And going back to what you were talking about, and I think this is really important for sort of getting these people out of your life, or at least putting them in positions that are okay for you, is setting these strong boundaries and not being willing to just kind of, well, they're my friend, oh, they're my sibling, they're my whatever, I guess I'll just do it for them again this other time, this time again and again and again. And it goes back to sort of just really knowing what it is that you're willing and unwilling to put up with. There may be some situations where you're willing to put up with some amount of things, but you have to pay attention to this sort of impact that has on you. Going to your parents' house and listening to them drone on about how you should have been some other type of career might be something that you're willing to put up with. But if it's something that's actually making you feel bad all the time and lowering your self-esteem and making you think like, oh, I chose the wrong path and my parents aren't proud of me and all this other stuff, then it's important to sort of shore up some of those boundaries and be willing to start making those motions.
Yeah. I
I'd
did
be
want to
curious.
add.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I did want to, like, when you gave that example, it just made me think of like, it is one thing if your parents are just kind of like criticizing and bashing you all the time. And it's just like, yeah, you want to remove yourself from that situation. But I think it's also, and it depends, every person's situation might be unique, but I think it'd be potentially, if you feel safe enough to do, like, worthwhile to like confront your parents about like how their actions and behaviors and what they say is impacting you, because they might not have any, like, maybe like a parent's just joking about like, oh, we could have had like a Ivy League or whatever that might be, and you're not, and just like kind of in a joking way, but it really could be hurting your feelings, and they are not really present and aware enough of like the impact of their words on you. So having them become aware of it, and if you keep telling them like, hey, I'm not cool with this, and if you continue to do this behavior that I don't like, I don't know if we can have a relationship anymore, which is unfortunate because I would like to have a loving, connected relationship with you. And if they still can't respect that boundary that you put in place and verbalize, then I think it would be, fair for you to like honor what you said, your word. You set that boundary of like, I said, I gave you some warnings, like, I this doesn't work for me for you to continue to like berate me or criticize, and it doesn't help my self-esteem and moving forward with what I want in my life. And so if they're consistently not respecting that boundary, then I think that's another red flag to keep in mind, and find someone that's willing to respect and honor you for what you need at that time. Yeah. So
Yeah, and I think that goes back to sort of this distinction we're talking about with toxic behaviors or toxic people. Because a lot of time there are behaviors that are toxic or just impacting people negatively that the originator has no idea that it is actually having that impact.
right.
I'll give one example. Like in my family, my parents would give my brother a hard time whenever he came over because he didn't come over very much. And so when he'd come over, they'd be like, "Oh wow, like you finally made it over here," some sort of sarcastic like remarks. And the intent was to be lighthearted, right? To just be like, "Oh, haha, you're finally here." But the way it was coming across was really negative, and it made it so that he wanted to go over and visit them even less, because every time he went, it'd be like, "Oh, haha, here's this joke. You finally showed up. Like, I'm here. Can you not spend, some of the time actually respecting that I am here, or appreciating, or connecting, or whatever else?" And there's tons and tons of situations like that just continue indefinitely unless you do start to push back on some of the boundaries, right? Again, like if it's a toxic behavior, people may not know that it's having that impact on you unless you're willing to say, "Hey, this is really not working for me. Like when I come over, I want you to just hang out with me and not do this, running joke, because it's not funny and it doesn't make me feel good. It makes me not want to come over anymore."
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's just so important because like a lot of people don't recognize, and a lot of people aren't comfortable sort of having that level of confrontation or whatnot. But if the foundation of the relationship is strong, it should be not too terrible of a conversation.
Right. And if you go in with the intention of setting your boundary and they make fun of you more or they make you feel worse, then that's like, yeah, then clearly maybe that is a toxic person in your life that you don't want in your life, and setting that boundary. I did want to like circle back to something you said earlier that I thought was important, was like that lip service where like people are just, constantly saying, and I kind of want to just like expand upon that a little more, in that I think like another red flag that I want people to consider is like, when they're really being like, they're really super mean and nasty. They get really terrible. They're criticizing you. They're calling you names. They're yelling and screaming at you. That is not great. But then all of a sudden they flip the switch, and then they're like, "Oh, well, I was just like, you made me feel like that. So, you brought out the worst in me, and I'm sorry, and I love you, and I will never do it again," kind of like a thing, kind of. And then it's just like that constant back and forth of like that vicious, mean behavior with a like loving, like love bombing is the word that I said. They're love bombing on you. They're speaking your praises, singing you songs that you would want to hear, making you feel good, to be like, well, there's so much love, I don't want to walk away because, we're in love, kind of a thing. And so I think that's an important thing to, like, if it's that kind of push and pull, instead of, him or her not willing to work on themselves to get to the root cause of what's causing their outbursts. Maybe they probably have their own trauma that they haven't dealt with, that they need to deal with, because that keeps showing up in your relationship. And that's not okay, because it's going to end up hurting you. So I think I just wanted to circle back to that because I thought that was an important point.
Yeah, and going on to sort of that same piece, I think the frequency and intensity are both really critical factors to look at, because we all lose our temper every once in a while. We may act that out
I've
in different ways.
Done it too. I'm guilty. I've cursed and yelled. I've been there. Yeah.
So it just goes back to like, if it's happening very frequently, if there's these big shifts in intensity, if the person is not taking responsibility and not willing, because you even said it in the wording that you use, like, oh, you made me feel this way, so then I act this other way. When people are using verbiage like that, it really shows that they're not willing to take accountability for the situation, and it's very unlikely that things are going to change until that first piece gets done. Because if you don't see yourself as sort of the initiator of actions or responses, then you're not going to see yourself as an agent who is able to change your future response, right? If I say, like, you make me mad, well, then I'm powerless to do anything, and you're going to continue to make me mad. So but yeah, that and paired with frequency, right? Like, blow-ups happen, stuff happens, but if it's like daily, even several times a week, even a few times a month, these super high intensity blow-ups, and like you said, the flip-flopping back and forth. Also the we've highlighted romantic relationships. I've definitely seen this in just normal friendships, right? Friends showing up like, oh, we're best friends, like, let's go do this stuff together, then huge blow up, then just back and forth. So just wanted to highlight some of the other signs to look out for, or pieces to look out for, as well as make it clear that this really applies to all sorts of relationships. It might feel like the details might be a little different, but it all ends up roughly the same.
Yeah, you make a really good point in that, we all experience, getting triggered, and, maybe we're not always so nice and when we're in the heat of the moment, but I think it is important for people to, like, distinguish and recognize within, develop the awareness within themselves of, like, when I feel like I'm triggered, I know I have done enough self-awareness work to know that I'm triggered, and so I might not be the nicest person ever. But I know, like, okay, give me a moment to calm down. I know we can have a more productive conversation, but I'm not going to be like, oh, love me, I'm so sorry, I was a jerk, I'll never do it again, kind of a thing. It's like, okay, let's try to understand why I had that reaction, what was going on internally for me to have that. The other thing that I know, because my partner has reacted at me too, like I reacted at him. One thing that I think helps us, because I get that he doesn't have control over those reactions, things from his past trigger him, like something silly I said, or like I could point at, like, the toilet seat not being put down, and he'll be like, he's like interpreting it as like he never puts it down, and I'm like, I never even said that, I never even said anything. And so he's like reacting over there as like a silly example. But for like more serious things, I usually, when we're in a more serious type of argument or conflict, I usually, and he does feel bad that he reacted in maybe not so nice of a way. Why he's a great partner for me is that he's willing to do the work, but I also need to communicate, like, these are the actions that I'd like you to take to work on yourself. So instead of like, oh, just figure this out for yourself, stop doing this, that's not always easy. I generally, like, okay, I'm like, you can go to therapy to clearly got to work on some inner child healing kind of a thing. Or, you could do workshops, or you can read this book. Sometimes I've given him like a book to read as like his homework. If you want to make it up for me, just saying sorry is not sufficient. That doesn't, like, I don't know if you're going to ever do this again. I'd like to reduce the possibility. It might happen again because, we're human. But for you to grow, I need you to take more actions of just saying sorry. So I give him like clear actions that he can take that's achievable, and it does enhance our relationship, and that's how we both keep growing and evolving. So yeah, I'll add that.
Yeah, and that's the ideal case, right? Where we actually have the space for us to work with the other individual to sort of figure things out and find a path forward. And that's an important point too, is I have seen from time to time people saying like, oh, you do this behavior and it makes me feel bad, and don't provide an alternative. In the ideal case, the other person goes and figures out what it is that they can do to sort of change things. But in the more realistic case, or at least harnessing as much of your power as you have to sort of make this change, having some ideas or helping them kind of brainstorm the types of actions that they can take that would be better is going to be far more useful.
Yeah.
There are going to be situations where you don't really know what they should do. Like, hey, you
Yeah.
keep losing your temper, but it's like you said, there's some sort of generic ones, right? Like if you don't have a temper and you don't have to deal with that, that's fine. You can still find books
Mm-hmm.
addressing that topic. Pretty much any sort of general problem that people have, other people have also had. So there are resources out there to kind of start working on these sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
On sort of a different note, I want to just circle back to the boundaries piece, right? So if none of this stuff is working, I'd be curious what you think are some of the initial steps for setting boundaries, because I know that for a lot of people, what happens is they say either they don't do it at all, right? That's the most
Mm-hmm.
common thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I
Yeah.
think that it's also common, like, hey, if you don't start treating me with respect, I'm gonna leave you, and then that's a hollow threat. I'll call it a threat, but
Right.
it's a
Like,
hollow statement, a
mm-hmm.
hollow boundary. So I'd be curious what you think is some of the starting points or entry points to building up some of these boundaries.
Yeah, I feel like that's it's like you have to respect me, otherwise I'll leave. It's like that's very open to interpretation, and two
Mhm.
people can have very different perspectives on what respect means. And so it's just like getting clarity on what that means. What does that look like? What are actions? Like if I were to, blow up, does that mean I'm disrespecting you? And so like the next time I blow up and then we're done. For me, I'd say it's like breaking it down into clear, actionable steps as much as you're able to. And so I will use another example, I guess, from my own life, because it's the easiest for me to speak from my own experience, is you have to be willing to walk away. Even if and this has happened to me a few times where, I have been in a really loving, caring relationship and he's a great guy. But, my last significant long-term relationship before my current one was almost 3.5 years. And he was a great guy, good guy, respectful, nice, kind. But he was just like, we had different values of what we wanted out of life. Like I wanted to have children and he was unsure about children. It wasn't a no, it wasn't a yes. It was just like on the fence. And that wasn't quite working for me anymore after 3.5 years of like, I can't just wait indefinitely for you. So even though there was so much love there, I was like, this is a make or break thing. It's like, if you're not willing to step up and you're just going to be in this weary state, undefined state indefinitely, you're not doing anything to help yourself figure that out for yourself, then this isn't working. And so ultimately we broke up, which was hard because there was so much love and he wasn't a bad guy. He was a great guy and a good partner. But it's just like knowing what you need for yourself and the relationship. So another example outside of kids might be like, I need you to respect me. Okay, that's very vague. Maybe I need you to give me a compliment twice a week or something like clear to feel like you're loved and you're respected. I need you to actually acknowledge me for this, and this anytime, like once a week. Like one of the things that we do in my relationship is like we acknowledge each other at the end of the day. And so that's a sign of respect. And, things that you interpret as disrespectful, like, oh, he didn't put away his dishes. How disrespectful of him. It's just like I have to also like rein myself in and realize, maybe he wasn't trying to be disrespectful. He just forgot and he got caught up in another thing. Maybe he got a message and had to hurry out of the kitchen. I don't know the situation. So to like take a step back and like be like, is this really disrespectful? If dishes is really important for me, then I also need to communicate. It's like, hey, let's have a system in place so this can happen. So those are some examples. I am sure you might be able to elaborate a little bit more on it, but I think it's just like creating as many actionable steps as possible would be a really great place to start and to really honor your word. It's like I think it's a matter of both parties honoring their word. Like, you say this thing and you do it, like, and if you don't do it, like you say, I want to have a baby or a house or whatever it is that you want, or a dog, whatever that might be. And you're like, if you're not willing to like join me on this, is this a make or break thing of the relationship? And you got to decide what that is for yourself, and honor your word of like actually walking away instead of like staying around and resenting that person indefinitely. It's not healthy for you either. But yeah, I feel like I'm getting a little off track from if that's toxic or not, and just more into general relationship advice. So yeah, that's where I'd start.
Well, yeah, I do want to hone back in on something that you said that I think is really important, which is if you're trying to set boundaries, to just be as specific as possible. Because like you said, if it's like, hey, you need to respect me. Well, what the hell does that actually mean?
Yeah.
What does that mean?
What does that mean?
So I'm going to go back to that example with my brother, coming over and like a potential solution or boundary could be like, okay, when I come over, what I would like is for you to, acknowledge that I'm here, appreciate it, whatever else. If you start teasing me about it, I will give you one reminder that like, hey, I really don't like this. I don't want you to do it. And then if you continue to do it, I'm leaving. I'm going home. And, a setup like that gives you just very clear steps, as well as kind of what you were talking about before, baking in a little bit of like, okay, there's this pattern, there's this behavior, or like, I don't know 100% what's going on in their life or whatever else, right? A little bit of a cushion to say like,
yeah,
I'm going to take some responsibility too. I'm going to remind you that I don't like this. And for sure, if you keep doing it after that, I'm just going to leave. By kind of breaking out each of those steps, I think it makes your boundary much easier to maintain, as opposed to my original example, which is like, if you don't respect me, I'm going to leave. Because like you said, like, okay, at what point does that trigger? At what point does that actually happen? Is, what does it take for me to say, okay, I'm just going to leave? Because then the other person doesn't have a clear idea either. So I just really wanted to highlight how useful I think that is in terms of setting boundaries, just knowing exactly what it takes, as opposed to this like, you make me feel bad and I don't want to feel bad. It's hard for the other side to really make adjustments, assuming again that it's toxic behavior and not a toxic person.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. We kind of trickled into the behaviors again. And that like, yeah, I don't think those people are being toxic people, but just like their behavior is toxic in a way and unhealthy. And yeah, that reminded me of like actually just an incident that happened in my relationship recently when we got in a fight. But he's not a toxic person. But yeah, sometimes he gets triggered and he gets caught up in his own fears and worries, and then it like manifests in not so great ways that I like, because it can be hurtful sometimes. But I had him actually create out like, what is your action plan? Like, I gave him like some of my recommendations, and he can choose to pick and choose what he wants. But I was like, let's have you write this down in your notes in your phone, so when this happens, you don't do the thing that you always do. You can look at your phone and be like, oh, step 1, 2, 3. These are the things that I wanted to do when this happens next. And maybe it'll work, maybe it won't, but you can modify that plan. But at least there's like a plan that I know, like that him honoring that plan that we set out together will make me feel, because I know that he's a human being like me, and we both get triggered from time to time and are not so nice. But we create a plan, and it's a constantly evolving plan that we've grown as a couple significantly, because we worked on various tools for ourselves, so our toolbox keeps kind of changing and evolving.
Yeah, no, I imagine that's pretty much the case universally, right? There has to be some back and forth of like, hey, what about this? Like, no, I'm not willing to do that. Okay, well, maybe we could solve the problem with this thing. And then you try it and you see how it goes. And like, oh, well, you know what? We're still circling into this pattern and we're still having this problem. Let's try this other angle. It's not always a one and done, like, here's the solution. You do this. Okay, I'll do it. Like it's much more collaborative and experimental process to figure it out.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we covered this topic pretty well. Do you have anything else you'd like to add or share?
Nope.
All right. Great. Well, we hope you got some value out of this conversation. If you're dealing with someone toxic in your life, if they're a person or if it's their behaviors, hopefully you got some tools and tips out of that. And if you think of something that we didn't think of, feel free to put that in the comments below. That'd be great. And be sure to like it as well. So that's it for today's episode. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like it and then go and subscribe to my channel and ring the bell so you get notified when the next video comes out. And if you check out in the description below, go to my website where you can get my free fast and easy guide to stress relief. Thanks again for checking us out, and we'll see you next time.